Yo, what is going on, everybody? You're watching the Awesome Fantasy Football Channel. I'm Dave Lockren, and joining me, as always, Matt Gajeski. Follow the man over on Twitter at Matt_Gajeski. Myself at Laffy_D for all your fantasy football needs. And, of course, hit that thumbs up as you walk in the door. Subscribe to the channel as well. We're going to get to 10K pretty soon. I feel it. Thanks to all of your support. Pretty new channel here. Just doing what we can through the fantasy football season to get you the information that you need. And today it is quarterback tiers. We already did running backs. You can check that out on the channel. We did wide receivers already. But, Matt, quarterbacks are a little bit different. There's a lot less of them, and they're not necessarily as integral when it comes to being sure that you have this many of them this early in the draft.
For sure. Quarterback has kind of been the forgotten position for a long time now. There was always this late round quarterback mantra, and that's because without injuries, these quarterbacks were guaranteed for similar opportunity on a week-to-week basis. Now, there's obviously talent differences, but you could stream quarterbacks on a weekly basis just because you knew they were going to be out there receiving the same, at least similar opportunity. This time, it's a little different. And I think over the years, quarterback has changed a little bit with the emergence of these runners, Lamar Jackson, Kyler Murray, even Josh Allen to a degree. And it has created some tiers, making just deciphering the tiers all the more important in fantasy.
So I guess first off, before we dive into the actual players here, we will go tier by tier and help to give you the reason we're going tiers here instead of just straight rankings. It gives you an idea of where you're grouping these players in, which ones you don't need to reach on if you can get a guy a couple around later, but maybe in the same tier, despite having a far off ranking. All of that stuff plays pretty heavily, whether you're playing standard, super flex, best ball, you name it. But Matt, really, what is your quarterback approach when you come into these drafts? Are you willing to draft one early, like a Mahomes or a Josh Allen, Kyler Murray, Lamar Jackson? Or is this generally a spot where outside of super draft that you are willing to wait?
I am willing to draft one early. With that said, I'm usually not trying to attack them and draft them over their ADP. If a quarterback like Lamar Jackson falls a few spots, unlike previous years, I am comfortable snagging them in the first round because I do think they give you a competitive advantage, especially the ones that have that rushing upside.
Yeah, so I guess what it comes down to really is I'm looking at, the top tier. Are you drafting? All right, let me back it up. Actually, let's say you're playing best ball leagues where you're over on Underdog Fantasy, and you and I did a draft not long ago. We were doing a bunch of live drafts here on the channel, and you had mentioned it very rarely are you willing to take more than two quarterbacks. Are you willing to draft backup quarterbacks in a standard redraft league with a 6-person bench?
I think you can in certain situations. One example would be if you're taking somebody like Trey Lance, who just has this tantalizing upside, but he
Justin
might not.
Fields.
Yeah, Fields. These guys that have really that untapped potential, but they may not be starting week one, or there's just some uncertainty surrounding their situation. For example, if you want to take a flyer on like a Deshaun Watson who hasn't been suspended yet, I think that could make some sense. But those are really the only situations where I would try that.
Yeah, or like Aaron Rodgers, Jameis Winston, before Aaron Rodgers, before we knew he was playing, Jameis Winston right now. You and I actually did one where we said, rarely will we draft three quarterbacks, but we did in that spot because we had Rodgers, who we got at a great discount, but also had Winston and kind of just backed it up and made it a little bit more palatable in the event that both of those guys somehow didn't play, but assuming one of the two were going to at least start. Matt, so let's dive into the tiers here. Up top, it's pretty obvious what we're dealing with. You've got Patrick Mahomes, who is going, third round ADP, Josh Allen, Lamar Jackson, Kyler Murray, Dak Prescott, Russell Wilson. I'm not putting all of these in the same tier, but just reading off, around the top 10. Then you have Herbert, Rodgers, Jalen Hurts, Burrow, all of those guys with ADPs spread out anywhere from 35 to a triple digit, 100 ADP. Who do you stick in the first tier here? And is Patrick Mahomes in a field of his own, or are we grouping him with guys like Allen, Jackson, and Murray?
I would actually rather have Lamar Jackson and Kyler Murray than Patrick Mahomes. I think they are a mini tier by themselves because of what they bring as rushers. Mahomes is fantastic. He's far and away the best passer in the league, but he doesn't have that rushing upside. If Lamar Jackson and Kyler Murray put together like 75% of what Mahomes can do passing and have an elite season on the ground, Lamar Jackson has back-to-back 1,000-yard rushing seasons. For fantasy football purposes, they're still going to significantly outscore Mahomes. I love Mahomes. I think he's just a little bit of a tier break below the two rushers because he doesn't have that ability.
What about Dak Prescott below these players? Now, he might not be the preeminent rushing quarterback in the league, but if you look at the 5 seasons he's been with the Cowboys, 6 rushing touchdowns, 6 rushing touchdowns, 6, and then 3, and then last year played only 4.5 games, had 3 rushing touchdowns. I won't prorate it, but if you were going to, he was on pace for, over 9 rushing touchdowns on the season. Can we factor that in and say, you know what, maybe he's not a guy that's going to rush for 10 every year. He might not be a 600, 700 yard rusher, but he does still have that element to his game on top of the fact that he's got insane pass catchers, an insane receiving core, a good offense, and now a healthy offensive line.
Yeah, I think he's firmly in the second tier. I would rather have Mahomes. I would rather have Josh Allen. But I think Dak Prescott has the same rushing upside, if not better rushing upside than Josh Allen. If you want to just compare the two, Josh Allen's had at least 8 rushing touchdowns every year in the NFL, but they've played without a goal line back. Their biggest back has been Devin Singletary. They did draft Zach Moss last year, who was injured for part of the season. That did allow Josh Allen to still function as that pseudo kind of goal line back. Prescott has more mobility just straight up than Josh Allen, in my opinion. And I think those two kind of get closer in their rushing production this year.
One thing I always find funny is looking at that disparity between rushing quarterbacks, which just absolute, you call it a cheat code in fantasy. If you've been around, you know that term is used often when it comes to guys like Allen and Lamar Jackson and Kyler Murray. Aaron Rodgers last year was the MVP, threw for 48 touchdowns, 4,300 yards, only 5 interceptions, and amazingly still finished 3rd in fantasy points at his position, Matt. That's crazy. Now, if you're for some reason in 6-point passing touchdown leagues, adjust things accordingly. Aaron Rodgers becomes a whole lot more valuable. But given that he finished 3rd and had 48 touchdowns, which is not something I can't project him to replicate that again this year. How do you rank him in terms of tiers with somebody like Jalen Hurts, who is going one spot after him on Underdog, who is not going to throw 48 touchdowns for sure, but does have that immense rushing upside?
I think there's a tier of quarterbacks that I'm trying to avoid for the most part. It's this tier you're talking about where we have players like Rodgers, Wilson, and Herbert. For what you mentioned, I think Hurts has the highest ceiling of this group just because of that rushing upside. I think he's extremely volatile. I think he easily has the least job security. Like, I wouldn't be surprised if he got benched this year for Flacco. I don't think it happens, but he's the most likely to end up getting benched. And when you compare Rodgers to some of these quarterbacks, he really had to hit his ceiling outcome to finish 3rd in fantasy among quarterbacks last year. He completed 71% of his passes. That was 9% higher than 2019. He threw for 8.2 yards per attempt. That was almost 1.5 yards higher than what we saw in 2019. 48 touchdowns. He only threw 26 in 2019, 25 in 2018, and those are all 16-game seasons. So Rodgers, now he's entering his age 38 season. That huge anomaly he put up at age 37, can he replicate that? I have significant questions.
So, okay, that's kind of where I'm at on one of these tiers altogether. You have Aaron Rodgers, who, if we're being fair, still is somebody that will once in a while rush for a touchdown or two. His rushing touchdown upside hasn't been terrible, but not his rushing upside. You're just talking goal line opportunities where he vultures a couple. That happens from time to time. But look at the rest of this tier. And if you want to break the tier down differently, feel free. I'm just throwing out what we've got in terms of ADP right now. You've got Joe Burrow, who played only 10 games last year before the injury. Not exactly someone, he's not statuesque, but he's not someone you expect to run a lot. Tom Brady being another one. Matthew Stafford. And then Ryan Tannehill. Ryan Tannehill can take off and run. I believe he did have 7 rushing touchdowns last season. But all of these guys, before you get to the guys like Lance and Justin Fields and Trevor Lawrence, before you get to those guys, because Lawrence actually does have some wheels, but sneaky rushing upside. Where do these guys work in for you? Like the Burrow, the Brady, the Tannehill, and the Stafford? Because I think all of them are solid options, and I'd be fine getting all of them. But is there one or two that you prefer more than the other in that range?
Yeah, I will say I think the quarterback I prefer the most outside the top 5 is Russell Wilson. And I think he's probably in a tier above the Burrows of the world just because he has rushing upside and they have a new OC in Shane Waldron who's expected to push the ball more, use more tempo. But in that tier you're talking about specifically where you have guys like Tannehill, Burrow, and Stafford, I don't think Tannehill and Burrow offer a significant edge on the ground. Their mobility is nice, but it's not going to be a huge difference maker week to week, especially maybe with Burrow coming off the injury. Who knows what that looks like? And Tannehill hasn't shown as much rushing upside recently either. But Stafford is somebody I think that has a lot of untapped potential playing in Sean McVay's offense, which was handicapped mainly by the presence of Jared Goff. I don't think that was anything having to do with Sean McVay himself. And we actually saw Goff have success early in his career. Stafford's easily the best signal caller that's ever played in that offense. So I'm really looking at him as somebody who could take a step forward and maybe jump a tier in the season.
Yeah, I'm with you. And it's not just Cooper Kupp and Robert Woods. Tyler Higbee has proven that when Gerald Everett's off the field, he can be a legitimate pass catching threat. If Deshaun Jackson stays healthy and you have that burner on the outside, I understand that he's old, but when healthy last year, he was somebody, and even the year before in that one game he started 2 touchdowns early against Washington on the Philadelphia Eagles. Deshaun Jackson is still a threat downfield if he's healthy. I don't know if he will be, Matt, but you also have Van Jefferson, who people have high hopes for. I mean, the offense, even without Cam Akers, is pretty loaded in LA this year.
For sure. And we even saw with Brandon Cooks in that field stretching role, it wasn't always the most productive role, and it didn't need to be to improve the offense overall. That opens up more of the field, just having that player who's your deep threat and can stretch the field, create space for other players. So even if Jackson maybe doesn't have the best fantasy season himself, I think his presence will improve the offense overall.
Now things get interesting. And hey, hit that thumbs up if you haven't done so yet. Subscribe to the channel. Much appreciated here. And follow Matt and myself on Twitter. Tyler, we can throw them right down beneath us. All right. This is one of those spots where I'm willing to, and let me map out the plan that I have, Matt, when it comes to guys like Lance and Fields. I love both of them. The hype around Lance right now is super high because, he's coming preseason debut, monster 80-yard touchdown pass. People get excited about that stuff, right? We know that. People get excited. People should be excited about Justin Fields too. He didn't do anything insane, and Matt Nagy also said that, there is no quarterback competition, even though I'm going to give him reps with the first team players and against the first team defense. I think eventually he'll come around and Fields will be starting this year. They traded up for him in the first round, gave away next year's first. There's a lot of reasons to suspect that Fields will also be starting. But I find it to be really interesting when you look at Lance and you look at Fields and you say, man, Lance is being drafted as a QB 12. So people are drafting this guy as a starter out of the gate. Justin Fields at 16. I like Fields a little bit more there just because I think you're getting a bit more value. But the biggest thing for me is I don't mind here taking a backup where if I have Fields, but my placeholder has to be Ryan Fitzpatrick to start the season or Matt Ryan to start the season. I think there are plenty of quarterbacks down there that might not be getting a ton of attention that could be fine placeholders through the first however many weeks of the year, even if you had to stream some guys on top of that until Fields or Lance gets the start. Yeah,
I think you're absolutely right. I'm actually really interested in this tier, and there's a lot of situations where I would rather wait on the prior tier we discussed with the Burrows and the Tannehills and just take a couple stabs here and just hope one of them pans out. And you can really shoot for some upside if you're drafting too. For example, if you take Lance, and they've been saying Garoppolo starts week 1. I don't think that's true. Kyle Shanahan hasn't been honest with us at all during this entire process. But say Garoppolo does start week 1 and you end up with Matt Ryan. Matt Ryan, I think, is a strong candidate to lead the league in pass attempts because of how bad that defense is. Offers you no mobility, but he does have strong pass catchers in Pitts and Calvin Ridley. You have a player like Tua Tagovailoa who's surrounded by all kinds of weapons this year. He has 2 new offensive coordinators calling plays for him. I think he'll take a step forward. Baker Mayfield is somebody who passed for over 275 yards in 5 of his last 6 games. And if you're getting really far down there, you have some job security and mobility in a guy like Zach Wilson, who has scrambling ability. I don't think he's going to come out there light the world on fire, but if you just need somebody to play for a week or two while Fields is on the bench before he emerges as the starter, I think those are good approaches.
Did you mention Derek Carr?
I did not mention Derek Carr. I have him a little lower, but I actually think he's another one that you could target in this range.
Yeah, I don't think it's the craziest idea. He was the QB 13 last year. They actually have a good offense, and I know Gruden takes a lot of heat, but the guy can at least call plays and open things up. Darren Waller, Henry Ruggs in his second year. Who knows what we get out of him? But Brian Edwards has looked very good. They brought in John Brown. I still think there's enough weapons here to make Derek Carr even somebody that's a perfectly reasonable spot starter for a couple of weeks. And the thing about Carr really is this offense actually was good last year. They weren't Aaron Rodgers, Green Bay good, but they put up enough points to where he's another one. And that's kind of what it all comes down to for me though, Matt. I could throw any quarterback out there and you could probably say, yeah, you know what? Makes sense. I think he'll be fine. Maybe not a Jared Goff who already looks like he's just going to be dinking and dunking in Detroit. And you don't want to grab like a Jameis Winston when we don't know whose role is defined. But even Sam Darnold has DJ Moore. He's got Terrace Marshall Jr. He's got Christian McCaffrey. He's got Robbie Anderson. A lot of these guys may not be good, but they have weapons. And those weapons should kind of cushion the blow if they don't play all that well themselves.
I think you're right. We saw Teddy Bridgewater be serviceable in 15 games last year. And Joe Brady, his offense didn't really run with any pace, which was kind of surprising considering they played with extreme pace at LSU. So I think that does regress positively. You see Carolina play a little bit faster. Derek Carr, I think, is a good option too. It continues to get better for him in Las Vegas, not only because they continue to add pass catchers and guys like Henry Ruggs. Hopefully he can take a step forward. But John Gruden cannot figure out the defense. All his draft picks he spends capital on haven't amounted to anything. You have Cleveland Farrell playing with the second team. He's allergic to drafting any position of consequence. They take Jonathan Abram in the first round a couple of years ago, and then they draft 3 safeties this year. Like, you can't play 4 safeties on the field at once. These guys aren't even playing consequential positions. This defense is going to be horrific. Derek Carr should be throwing the ball constantly.
Do you think that we should be concerned about the offensive line?
I think they have a good offensive line coach, and they have made additions. Like, they invested a first round in Leatherwood, which I think was a little rich, but at least they have replacements for some of those guys. And, a player like Colton Miller took a lot of steps forward under their current offense. I don't think that'll be as glaring of a weakness as people are saying.
All right. Is there anyone else down here in this lower tier, this kind of basement tier at the quarterback position that makes sense to you, stands out as potentially a last-ditch attempt to grab maybe a best ball stack with a quarterback, or even, like I say, a deep league or a super flex league where you waited to get your second quarterback and now you're kind of just settling on number 2?
I think Daniel Jones is worth talking about. I do not like him from a talent standpoint, but he has great mobility. This defense is going to be terrible, and we kind of like his weapons. It's maybe one tier down from like a Carolina's offense, but they have Saquon Barkley, Kenny Golladay, assuming he's healthy, Sterling Shepard, Darius Slayton. They drafted a first-round gadget player in Kadarius Toney. Still have Evan Ingram. They had Kyle Rudolph for red zone situations. Their offensive line is bad, but that's a ton of weapons for Daniel Jones. Again, I don't think he's going to be elite, but if you're just taking a very late-round superflex quarterback, he makes some sense to me.
Matt, who will be the QB1 by season's end?
Lamar Jackson.
Yeah?
I think it's Lamar Jackson or Kyler Murray because of their rushing ability.
Okay.
One sneaky guy, Trey Lance, if he starts week 1. I do not think Trey Lance is a great passer, but he has that rushing upside. For reference, he has under 400 career pass attempts in college at North Dakota State. I know Kyle Shanahan has a very friendly offense, but I still would prefer Lamar Jackson with better weapons, Kyler Murray with better weapons, and their rushing upside.
And last thing here, if you're drafting Lamar Jackson over on Underdog or wherever it is that you're playing best ball, are you looking to stack him? Do you mind running him naked for the entire season, meaning without any pass catchers? Do you take a shot maybe on a sliding Rashad Bateman since the injury? Do you go to Marquise Brown? Do you go to Mark Andrews? Anybody there that you think is kind of someone you'd really like to get in the stack with him?
He's really interesting, and I wouldn't force a stack because they have so many weapons this year. Last year, the year prior, you knew where the targets were going. They were going to Marquise Brown. They were going to Mark Andrews. This team is the run heaviest team in football. If those targets start to get spread, I think it could be really hard to predict those spiked weeks, and maybe there are few of them for the pass catchers overall. With Lamar Jackson running for over 1,000 yards in back-to-back seasons, I don't think you necessarily have to stack him to benefit.
That'll do it for us. Matt, great stuff as always. Thanks for hanging out with us, guys. We will catch you back here to close out this series talking tight end tiers later in the week. I'm Dave Locker, and that's Matt Gajewski. You're watching Awesemo Fantasy Football. Peace.